Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to this week's episode of Expert Opinion. I'm Chris, and I serve as one of the pastors at the Journey Church, and I'm excited for tonight's conversation. This morning in church, we talked about the mask of addiction and had a moment in our worship service for all of us to consider addiction in our own life. And so tonight, I'm really excited about our two guests that we have with us tonight. Chris McFadden, who serves as the president and CEO of Adult and Teen Challenge, and David Lewis, who serves as the executive director of Western Pennsylvania. And just excited to have a conversation with them as they are what I would call experts on addiction, and they are in relationship and in kind of front seat of addiction in our own state, and yet I think can help us all understand how to respond in our own life or with those around us. And so I welcome everyone to our next edition of Expert Opinion. Feel free, like we have done every other week, if you have a question for Chris or for Dave, feel free at any point to put that in the comment box, and I'll be making sure to ask the question to them. So I'm going to bring up my new friends up on the screen now. And welcome, Chris and Dave. Thanks so much for joining Expert Opinion tonight.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, I would love for each of you just to introduce yourself for a moment and just kind of give us some briefs. So I'll start with you, Chris.
Sure. Chris McFadden again, President CEO of Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. Our organization is really spans throughout Pennsylvania, and we have adult centers in Western PA where Dave leads that campus. It's an adult male center. We have an adult female center in Philadelphia. And then we have our corporate headquarters, which has adult men and women, which is in Berks County. And then we also have an organization called the Naaman Center, which is in Dauphin County and in Lancaster County. And we're a faith-based organization. We offer behavioral health care services for individuals suffering with addiction, and it includes a full continuum of services. So we have medical, clinical, and discipleship services. And the way I usually talk about our organization is through our vision statement, which is bringing wholeness to the hopeless. And our focus is on a well-rounded relationship with God, family, work, church, and community.
Thanks, Chris. Dave, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Dave Lewis. I'm the executive director, as Chris said, of the Western Pennsylvania campus. We're about 15 minutes northeast of the city of Pittsburgh. And I've been director here for 6 years now, almost. And I'm also a graduate of the program that I went through the program back in 2001.
That's great. I would love for the two of you just to share a little bit around kind of what you do at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. And then I kind of ask the kind of tied with that question, like what led you both to your work and a little bit about your own journey in this.
Yeah. So for me, maybe I'll lead in with that question of what led me to the organization. As Dave referenced, being a graduate of the program, I myself am also a graduate of Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. I came into the program back in 2006, and if little funny story is that when I came into the program, I was at Dave's site as a student in the program, and Dave was a counselor in that program. But for me, it started in northeastern PA. I grew up in a non-faith based type of home, no Christian environment, and I idolized athletics and was able to throw things really well, and ended up being able to play football at a junior college, and then went to a Division II school up in that area. And in my very first game starting as the quarterback, I ended up ripping my collarbone off of my throwing arm and ended up going to the hospital. And one thing I didn't mention is grew up in a single parent home with my mom. And, that's kind of the typical story, I guess, of growing up and getting into this type of addictive pattern with a single parent home. And before you know it, those pills took over my life. It was a very traumatic event for me, and just clung to those pills, which led to far worse things, and took me to places I didn't want to be, and legal trouble and all kinds of stuff. But I would say by the sheer grace of God, He landed me in this organization to receive the help that I needed at that point, and stayed on afterwards, became an intern in the organization, became a staff person, became a director. Then I eventually became the chief operating officer, and in 2015 stepped into the role of president and CEO. But when I started, I forgot to mention this, when I graduated the program and stayed in as an intern, my very first job was I ran the housekeeping team. So I was the guy responsible for taking out the trash and cleaning the toilets, and that was my gig and my the beginning of my career here at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. And God's calling on my life has been just extraordinary.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. I just appreciated just hearing where you started,
Yeah.
housekeeping, and in the sense of humility there, and led you kind of all throughout the organization to where you are now. I think that's
I don't want to forget that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a helpful spot, helpful place. Yeah. Dave, share a little bit too.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that's one of the things of our program that makes it very successful is nobody that comes through can say to me and Chris, "Oh, you don't know what I'm going through, man," because we went through it. So I grew up kind of different from Chris. I had a Christian upbringing, 2 Christian parents, never divorced, they were always together. And I lived in the suburbs. I had everything handed to me on a silver platter. Sky was the limit for me. And I decided to go the opposite way. Started hanging out with some kids I shouldn't have been hanging out with. My parents were both working, so I'd get off the bus and no one would be home, and started getting myself into trouble. My first little rebellion was smoking cigarettes at like age 12 or 13. And then that moved to smoking marijuana. And then marijuana truly is the gateway drug, because once you get over that hump, especially if you're raised in a home where, your parents are at least somewhat telling you, we don't accept certain behaviors. Once you get over that psychologically, then you go on to the next thing, which is alcohol. Then you go to the next thing, to harder drugs. And then before I know it, by the time I was a senior in high school, I was totally addicted to every drug you can think of, to any drugs that I could get my hands on. And then my story is at age 18, the summer after I graduated from high school, I accidentally overdosed on a drug called LSD. And I took over 100 hits, and it put me into a drug-induced psychosis, which lasted for over 40 days.
Wow.
So I wrecked my father's car into a construction site, hit a guy, got charged with felonious assault, and I got thrown into jail, where I sat in that drug-induced psychotic state for 30 days. And it was then that my parents, I'm from Northeast Ohio, my parents were at their wits' end. They didn't know what to do. They reached out to Teen Challenge Crisis Center in Youngstown, Ohio. And that was the beginning of my journey into getting help. I went to Cleveland Teen Challenge at first. I left there after 3 days because they hadn't medicated me, so I was still in the psychotic thing. Then I went home to my parents' house. They gave me about 6 months to live with them and try to stay off of drugs and alcohol. So if there's any families watching that have experienced this, trying to help your loved one by giving them resources, here, you can live with us, just try to get off the drugs. That's what I did. And I just kept relapsing. I kept going back over and over again. And then finally, my parents had to exercise what's called tough love. And they had to say, listen, you're an adult now. And my dad, by the way, had paid $5,000 for a good lawyer. So the lawyer worked for him, not for me. He reminded me of that. The only thing keeping you out of jail is this lawyer I paid for, and we're done with you using drugs in our home. And there was 2 younger siblings I had that they were worried about. So they pushed me to Teen Challenge, which, by the way, we'll talk about that. That's most people come to our program unwillingly. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a reality. You don't have to be willing to get help to actually get help. That's a myth. Oh, you got to wait till they're ready. Well, no, you can put a little bit of pressure on them. So January 1st, 2001, I unwillingly went into the Teen Challenge program here in Pittsburgh. And now, what is it, 19, almost 20 years later, here I am. God has restored me. I have a wife, family. God is good.
thank you, Chris and Dave, for just sharing your story honestly and openly. And I would love just to hear, just to kind of go a little bit deeper in kind of your own journey with addiction, but also with your work. Like what has it taught you about kind of addictions? What has it taught you about addictive behavior? Dave, what would you say to that?
Well, I always tell this story. So I remember the first time that I experienced the high of marijuana. So I was the type of kid who, in middle school, I'm just totally worried about everyone's opinion of me. Am I cool enough? Am I athletic enough? Do I have the right clothes? Do I have a girlfriend? All that. And just miserable. I hated school because of it. I'd go to school every day and it was like misery because I didn't like the social situation, and it caused me anxiety. The first time I smoked that marijuana and got that effect, this is the best way I can describe it. It's like all that just melted off of me. That's what made it so seductive for me. It's just like it took me out of myself to the place where I was like, this feels so good. I don't care what people think about me now. Now that I reflect on it and from a biblical perspective, what I found was my God. I found an object that I could worship and it would give me peace, pleasure, security, comfort, power. It gave me everything I wanted. And I remember thinking that day, and there's a lot of guys that have told me they have the same experience. I remember thinking, I want to feel like this all the time, like always, and then that's what hooked me. And then, of course, you find other substances that make you feel even better than marijuana. And then they're more powerful than marijuana. And then before you know it, I was hooked. And I was stuck on that. So that's kind of where my experience led me, to the point where when you worship a false god, you have to make sacrifices to it, and it transforms you into its image. And, that's really the root of our discipleship program, is teaching the men that what's happened to you is you've been put in spiritual bondage because you're worshiping a false god and it has corrupted you. And what we need to teach you to do is worship the true God to be transformed in the opposite direction. But that involves sacrifice. See, the issue is a sacrifice to a false god, right? That gives you instant results, but long-term suffering. When you sacrifice to the true God and bow the knee to him, he doesn't always give you instant gratification. Many times he makes you suffer first, right? In order to be transformed. And that's what I'm still learning that. 19 years later, I'm still learning that I have to make sacrifices up front to be conformed to the image of Christ in my life. But that's really the core. Chris also mentioned we have the medical and we have the psychological services, which are crucial. But what makes us unique is we have the spiritual, biblical worldview understanding of that core issue of it, what addiction is and what it does to a human made in the image of God.
Yeah. I would just add and just say that and Dave mentioned that worldview comment there, and I would say that there is an actual culture of addiction. And when you live among that and within that culture then shapes your worldview, so that that becomes your chief end, is finding that substance that you need to make you not sick. But then the entire environment shapes then how you see the world. And before you know it, time is gone. You're really, really caught up in that whole stigma side of addiction, where you're hiding in those shadows. And I think part of that probably is the reason why you think people with terrible addictions, they don't usually come out in the daytime. I don't know. There's something spiritual about that. I think but I really think it's true. And just the stigma of addiction is what ends up aiding that and even supporting what Dave is saying, even to greater lengths, when you just want to hide. And that's the easiest way to utilize all of those enabling tactics that the best of us can do when we're caught up in that state.
And I appreciated, I think, both of you, kind of the language of like culture of addiction, or even just the nature, Dave. I just like the way you named it, like that it is a God, in that like there are sacrifices that have to be made to the God. And even this morning, I think, like I shared earlier, we had a sermon surrounded addiction and kind of giving space, which is why I'm so appreciative of the two of you joining me tonight, just to kind of keep the conversation going, really as people who are on the front lines of this. And yet in the scripture, I kind of quoted Romans 3:9, and it says, where are any of us better off, right? So Paul went on this long litany of all the sins, all the temptations, all the struggles, and Paul says, are any of us better off? And Paul says, not at all. And so I would love to know from your perspective, would you say that are certain people more prone to having maybe addictive behavior, or more prone to the temptation of addiction of whatever sort? Or is it common to some, or is it the potential for all? Like, just help me understand that a little bit, and what leads someone to maybe to be completely controlled by addiction in a really real way. Dave, what would you say to that?
Well, yeah, that's a very complex question. People have been trying to figure that out for a long time.
Yeah.
There's several answers to that. There's a biological answer that many are trying to research. Is there a genetic component?
Mm-hmm.
If you have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who were prone to addiction, is that passed on? I think that's still an open question. There's a lot that would say that it is true. There's also a psychological answer to that, where you would say that I think it's a fact that those that grow up in homes where they don't have emotional support, don't have good values instilled on them, and just good, being loved, being supported, can tend to fall into addiction. Not immediately because of the chemical. I think a lot of times the culture of the peer group is what hooks people in more, and those people might happen to do drugs and alcohol, and it's a way to fit in. And then it becomes an addiction. And, the addiction part is that part where that feeling, that high that you get, it like hits a sweet spot in you. Like, my wife, for example, she does not like the way that drugs make her feel. I mean, she got like Vicodin or something for a wisdom tooth, and she's like, I don't like these. And I was looking at her like, what do you mean you don't like those? Like, what are you talking about? They're great. So some people like that, There's also a lot of research out there. And if parents are listening, you need to hear this. There's a lot of research that says, like, let's just take alcohol for one example. If a person waits until they're 21 to have their first experience of a drink of alcohol, the likelihood they will become an alcoholic is like 80% less. It's like a crazy statistic. Okay, so that alcohol age is actually researched out. Whereas if somebody drinks alcohol before that age, when their brain isn't fully developed, there's a lot more. So that's another thing. The age of first exposure has a lot to do with whether someone develops a full. Not always, though. Not always. You can have people that get addicted later in life. So yeah, I think there's a lot of it's a complex question. But I think the answer of what do you do to prevent it is you really, as a parent, have to keep an eye on where your kids are and who they're with and who their influences are. Because if you can prevent that experimentation phase, then you can cut off a lot of it at the pass. That's like my parents just let me go hang out with whoever I wanted. They didn't really check on who I was with. I would lie and say, I'm going to this person's house, and I'd be gone. They wouldn't know where I was at, and I was getting in all kinds of trouble. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, Chris, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think he nailed it, and it's a very complex question when you look at all those different components. But I think he nailed it.
Yeah, I just appreciated just some of what you said, right? So the psychological or the emotional, right? The love and the tender care, but that goes beyond just providing. Because I think, Dave, it's beyond just providing, but it's the true kind of nurturing in the sense that where are kids hanging out? Like, who are they hanging out with? And that love, the tough love that could be earlier in that process. But you also named the age of first exposure, which I think is really like good and experimental age. And is there a difference around addiction for teenagers versus adults? I know your program is predominantly kind of working with adults. And so, like, is there a difference between addiction or even, just would love to ask that maybe basic question. And any thoughts you have on that, Dave? I'll start with you first.
You mean between teenagers and adults and how it manifests? Yeah. So I mean, so same thing. Physically, a teenager's brain is not even close to being developed yet. And if you talk to a neurologist, they'll talk about what is it? The frontal part of the brain that determines like decision making is not fully developed, but the part that has to do with risk taking is fully active. So that's why, if you ever wonder why your teenager's so crazy, that's why, from a neurological point of view, their brain isn't developed yet. So when they take those drugs, it can be fueled. It's a risk-taking behavior. It's a behavior that really fuels that part of the brain. And also there's a psychological understanding of, a teenager, like that was my experience, that psychological thing hooked me. And then of course, spiritually, just a teenager is not knowing their place in the world. They're still exploring that. And, drugs can really help them find their mark. I mean, for most teenagers you meet that are addicted to drugs, and this could contrast with an adult, most teenagers are not sitting there going, I just love doing drugs for the sake of doing drugs. I'll just sit in my room by myself and get high. I mean, some people, but usually it has to do with their friends. Okay, they like to go party. They like to go hang out with their friends. They have other friends. Now, when you get to an adult, this is when you're getting into full-blown addiction. I don't even want to be around people. Wow. My drugs are for me. I'm not sharing them. I might have some buddies that help me get drugs, and we get them together, pool our money or something, but it's not a social thing anymore. It becomes a true addiction. So if you have a teenager who's in that phase where it's still about their friends, you still have some hope if you can get them away from those friends and get them around some positive peer groups. There's still some interventions you can do. Whereas in the adult, when you're an adult, that's a whole nother ballgame, because now you're independent and there's a lot more things that go into fueling an addiction for an adult than a teenager.
And the whole side of, again, I mentioned stigma, and when adults are, and this certainly could be with a teenager as well, but I know for like my own personal experience, at a certain point as a upper 20s, mid 20s, I guess I should say, I was never that, who's supposed to like end up like that. Nobody grows up saying, hey, I want to be like this when I grow up. Yeah. And then the hiding and the shame and the guilt, it only just causes the addiction to grow worse and worse and worse for an individual. And that's a very important point for us to, and this topic I speak a lot about is the stigma of addiction, and the way that we as a society talk about addiction, and whether, even just the way that we refer to people. Are we calling people things like addicts, junkies, alcoholics? Or are we saying like this is a person who has an addiction? Even those that the usage of certain types of words help us to allow people to have that transparency to say, hey, I have a problem, to be able to seek some sort of treatment. And I really think this is one of the critical points that we have to see coming from the other end, not as the person in addiction, but the church or just the local community. And I find the church to honestly be the worst with this for whatever reason. And I think it's because of a huge lack of education. And I've heard, whenever I talk to folks that are in the community, that are engaged in the recovery community, they've learned how to talk about addiction because they know about stigma. But I find that when I talk about this topic with a lot of folks in the church, they don't know how to talk about it, and they still will refer to people as things. And then the person who is in the addiction will feel like a thing, which is an addict or a junkie or something like that. And one of the things that we say a lot is, it's like a person who, let's say somebody who gets diabetes from having, from their dietary decisions, or somebody gets lung cancer from tobacco or something like that. We don't refer to those people as those things. We say it's an individual with a condition. Yeah. And when we can learn on the other end of your question as the community to talk about this, I think it opens up people to have that receptivity toward recovery. And I think that's just as important as the stuff that Dave was talking about.
Yeah, if I may follow up with that, I think I think you just spoke a lot of truth there, Chris, even to me as a pastor. And so I want to ask a follow-up question to say, so there is stigma to addiction and to persons who who are struggling. And so let me ask you, what are helpful ways for Christians and pastors to talk about this conversation, and what are unhelpful ways? Like, help me, teach me, maybe even
Sure.
honestly,
I
right?
get it.
And show our community like what's helpful, because I think you're right. Churches stink at a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so, what would be some helpful ways?
Well, people, and we know as a faith community that people are created in the image of God. That's a very basic concept in Genesis 1, and it goes throughout the scriptures. And we know that as a faith-believing people, that the concept of identity is extraordinarily important. And what is our identity, and what are we identifying with? So when I would say, like, what are unhelpful ways to refer to people that are in addiction, how to talk about it, is, again, it's those labels. It's calling people things, as a junkie or an addict. This is very hard to do because people are so used to using, especially the word addict, and people just associate the word addict with addiction. And I think some of the helpful things to remember as a believer in Jesus, that we are to see all people as having been created in the image of God. And when that is the guiding principle for our worldview, we then will see that this is a person with an addiction. They're not things, they are people who are created in the image of God. Even if we disagree with the decisions that they're making, well, there's a whole lot more that goes into it. So we need to always remember that they're human beings and they're created in the image of God. And I think that's a very basic way to say it.
Yeah.
But I think I think the way that we talk about it is extremely important, because what ends up happening is if we keep calling people addicts and junkies, well, is that going to make the person who might even be sitting in your church, who's dealing with a severe addiction, and then we will use the word addict or junkie from the pulpit, is that person who's sitting in the pews going to say, hey, Pastor Chris, can you help me with my addiction? They're going to say, no, this guy is judging me as a thing. And when we can properly talk to people as we value you because you're created with that inherent sense of dignity and worth, that we want to be able to help you with this problem that you have. I think that's extraordinarily important for the faith community, whether you're a pastor or you're just somebody sitting in the pews. How do we talk about addiction so that other people will be willing to talk to us about their addiction?
That's right.
And I think again, it comes back to that concept of being created in the image of God with that sense of inherent dignity and worth as God's creation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think part of what you're helping us, I think, see is how to remove guilt and shame from labels and from the conversation, and how do we have an orientation of even how God sees all of us, and to kind of see people as God would see them. Dave, anything you would add to that question?
Oh yeah. So you mentioned Romans 3. The Apostle Paul says, "Are we any better?" No. We're all sinners.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. We can't rank sin as pastors. So, the pastor should be up there talking about his sin and his struggles and level the playing field. Right. And although we need to acknowledge that, I'll speak as a recovering addict, so I can say this about myself. I mean, people had good reason to stigmatize my behavior at certain points in my life. Like, you should have watched your purse when I was around, because I would have stolen your money out of it. Okay. So let's, there's a sense in which that there's some truth there. But as far as how you treat a human being, we're all sinners. And that's what we're terrible at that in the church. It's, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, right? The Pharisees, I'm glad I'm not like that guy over there. And the other thing too is, you'd be surprised, those same people who act like that probably have a niece or a nephew or even a son or a daughter who's an addict, and their way of coping with it is another type of sin called self-righteousness. It's also a sin. So, we as pastors should be talking about that sin as well. But I mean, that's why, when I went through Teen Challenge, and we still do, I had a lot of pastors who worked there as counselors, and they did not have a background in addiction at all. But it was powerful because they talked about themselves as sinners, and their sin is no different than mine. And this kind of does come to the Christian worldview. See, the Christian worldview levels the playing field, because we're all made in the image of God and we're all born sinners. The other worldviews, like the biological explanation and the psychological explanation of addictions, although they give you insights into some of the, what you observe in someone who has these addictions, it kind of does create a us versus them. Oh, well, your brain's biologically broken and mine's not. Oh, you're psychologically messed up and I'm not. See, the Christian worldview just undercuts that. No, we're all sinners. Our sin just manifests in different ways. I should have got addicted to money, right? Well, I'm joking, right? From a Christian worldview, that's ridiculous. But if I would have been obsessed with being a millionaire in high school and that would have made me not do drugs, maybe I would have been better off. But actually, no, I wouldn't have, because I wouldn't have come to know Christ.
That's right.
And that's how I look at my story. And I know Chris does too. Like this detour God took us on through an addiction led us to Christ, into the ministry we're doing now. So that's the other thing. The men, let's talk about identity. The men that have such success in our programs are the ones who see the battle with addiction that they went through as the means God used to call them into his kingdom and help others. I mean, those are our guys who really are powerhouses that go out and change the world and advance the kingdom of God, who come. I mean, I can name, Chris could too, a lot of guys that are out there that went through our program that are out there in the community, changing their community. And why? Because their identity was changed. It wasn't that we got them off of drugs. We got them clean, right? We got the stuff out of their system. We got them healed physically. We helped them grow up emotionally. But what really fixed them is they said, you know what? I have an identity now. I'm in Christ. I'm forgiven. I'm a child of God. Now my job is to go advance his kingdom and help others and rescue others from the same mess I was in. That's really the breakthrough that we're looking for with men that come through our program and women.
Wow. Amen, man. Amen. Thanks for, I think that is so, and even in our own church, right? I know of a variety of men and women who that's a part of their own testimony, right? Of God using kind of terrible things that's happened in their life to draw them so near and so close to God. And they are probably some of the most powerful, faithful believers in the Lord because they recognize where they once were and they recognize where they are now. And it's all because of the power of Jesus. And so, hey, thank you. You get me fired up right now. So I'll try not to preach. You two are the preachers right now. So let me ask you this, right? So we have all endured kind of a global pandemic over the last couple of months, right? And we call it COVID-19, right? And it's been, I think, emotional. It's been filled with grief and trauma. And something that we have even named at our own church and kind of considering and praying about is, and really want to ask the two of you, I would love to, how are you just understanding all of this global pandemic that we're living through? But maybe more importantly, what has been your experience with those who have been in the recovery process and maybe have relapsed, or persons who've become addicted in a new way in this season? And so to deal with a kind of coping. So how would you respond to that? And I'll start with you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this question a couple of times now, and I always start with the story of a couple that called me, a mother and father, who had an adult son who was living with them, and he was doing really well. He was going to church, he was going to a Celebrate Recovery group, he was going to a 12-step group, and he was off of drugs and alcohol. He was doing well. And the COVID-19 thing hit and everything got locked down. And then they said no more groups of 10 or more, that whole thing. And they said he just went downhill fast, because now all of a sudden he couldn't go to these groups. He couldn't go get the support he needed. And he ended up relapsing. And they called me, just, what do we do? And to be honest with you, I felt powerless. Like, our programs remained open. So, I said, well, we could try to get him into our program. And he wasn't in a place where he would commit to something like we're an inpatient program. The commitment level is a little higher than, a more of an outpatient here in Western PA. But, my heart broke for them, because for many of us, the community that we get plugged into, especially in early recovery, especially when you're, a year or two out, that community is huge, because it gives you that support. You can talk through your issues. You have that love and support. And that just got cut off for how many people, because of what the decisions that our leaders made to protect the public, and said, we're going to shut these things down. So what I've been hearing is, there's a lot of people. And then like the legal system, which is a help for some guys because they're on probation, parole, that was shut down. So they no longer had their probation officer checking on them to making sure they were doing okay. And they just went off the deep end there. So, as things start to reopen, I'm working with the court system, for example, and I have a lot of probation officers telling me that once this thing gets in full swing, there's going to be a lot of people that need help because they've been just kind of off on their own. So that just the impact of COVID just on shutting down community gatherings has been big for those who have addictions.
Yeah, I would say another story. A guy who was still in that status that Dave is talking about in a little bit earlier recovery, like 2 years, and he ended up overdosing and dying. And a lot of people who were close to this guy were talking about how hard he was taking being locked down, and it's a really, really sad story because some folks also have mental health stuff going on with addiction. And throughout this time, I mean, we know of a number of people who have overdosed or died, and I've heard plenty of stories of suicides. And that's a it's been a very, very challenging thing. And I just want to add that our program, we're a faith-based program, and we have all the services that the folks that you would be working with and would be watching. We have a medical detox program so that we can help people who are going through withdrawal for alcohol, benzos, or opiates. We have the short-term clinical program at both of our sites, and we have the women's program in Philly. That's about a month-long period of time, and it's a really good stepping stone for people who are not necessarily willing. As Dave referenced, some folks are just not willing to commit to a year-long program when they're confronted with, hey, you need to go to Teen Challenge. Well, how long is it? It's a year. No, thanks. Yeah. So we have a detox, that 30-day program, but then we have those as complementary programs to our long-term discipleship program, which then in total is a year. And like I said at the beginning, we have the Naaman Center, like Naaman in the Bible, if you need to know how to spell it. And we have various locations in Dauphin County and in Lancaster County for other folks who might be just a different level of care. So we have services for people who are in active addiction. Like right now, somebody could get a hold of our team, and on our website has all of our information, paatc.org, and you could find all of our programs and services and phone numbers and everything you would need right on our website.
Thank you. Thank you for remaining open and continue to do your work in the midst of how essential your work is. I have kind of like 3 final questions, and they're all varied, but I think I'll start with this question. If someone is listening right now, or someone who may listen to the future, is currently fighting an addiction and not finding treatment, or struggling, what would you say to them as two leaders?
Go ahead, Dave.
So I'd have 2 separate messages. One would be for the individual, and the other would be for the family. So, but it's kind of the same message for both. There's a saying that's out there that's very true. It goes like this: until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of the change, you're not going to get help.
Wow.
So many times, pain is being caused by the addiction, but the person with the addiction is thinking, well, what it would take for me to change would be so painful. Like, for example, I'd have to go to a drug treatment center. Like, I can't do that. But what you need to ask yourself is, how much pain are you willing to put up with before you're willing to take a step that, it's going to be painful. I mean, we don't have a magical cure here. We don't, step in here and you'll be fine in 5 seconds. I mean, there's pain, there's sacrifice that's involved to get help for an addiction. Yeah. But compare it to the pain that you're going through. And you got to assess where people are at in their recovery. I mean, in early recovery, somebody, when I was in early addiction, my life was great. I thought I was having fun. I was getting high. I had no cares in the world. But then I got arrested. Then pain started happening, and I started having family problems. And, in my testimony, the Lord really had to smack me on the head. And then for parents that are listening, or because we live in a culture now, I mean, maybe a generation or 2 ago, the child would just be said, okay, you're 18, get the heck out of the house, go live, go on. That doesn't happen anymore. People live with their parents till they're in their 30s. So it's just a different culture. So a lot of parents, you might have your adult child in your home and they're doing drugs and you don't like it and you don't approve of it, but you don't know what to do. Well, that's where you need to have an honest conversation with your loved one. And there are some strategies where you can lovingly and gently, you don't have to just kick them to the street right away, but you lovingly and gently kind of turn up the heat a little bit and say, look, we're not going to put up with this very long. I always recommend a written contract too. Like, let's put it in writing. Okay, we're going to give you 3 strikes and you're out. If you bring drugs into our home again, this will be the consequence. If you continue to do the, and kind of lovingly show them, there's going to come a point where we're going to have to stop supporting this behavior, especially if you're their main, you're letting them live in their bedroom and paying all their bills. When they're an adult, you're going to kind of push them. And then for the mother who's like, I could never do that to my son, you can always put a brown bag lunch on the front porch every day and make sure they're fed and give them clothes to wear. Like, you don't have to abandon them to, but you have to tell them, like, look, we cannot continue to co-sign this behavior because it's going to kill you. And that's really, at our admissions office, and I get a lot of these calls too, just really walking the families through how to process that. And then if it's a couple, the dad wants to, we need to take action now and kick him out. And the mother's like, no, that's my little boy. And then they fight about it. And then there's division, and there's a lot to it. There's entire professionals called interventionists. So that's all they do is try to help families get their loved one into help. But my main message would be, just think about the pain you're experiencing. And this is the other thing I talked about, how these false gods corrupt our thinking and our soul. The reason why we can't think many times when we're in the grips of an addiction, we can't think a month in advance or 6 months in advance, because it's corrupted us into just being about instant pleasure, instant gratification. And we just need to pray. And that's the other thing about prayer. That's the last thing I'll say. If you're in an addiction, cry out to God right now. If you're watching this and God in his providence has brought you, cry out to him right now. Say, God, help me. And then if you're a loved one, pray that God would bring pain into your loved one's life. And that might sound crazy, but that will change you as well. Yeah. Because if you're the person, put them in the hand of the good Father who will bring into their life what he needs to bring in, and then be ready to act when you see that pain. So, for example, this is a very common testimony. I've had parents tell me this. I gave them that advice, and then a month later, they get a phone call from their son, and he's locked up in jail. Mom, come bail me out. Oh, wait a minute. That was the answer to the prayer I was praying. You're in pain now in jail. Let's see if we can use this to motivate you to get help. That's some practical advice that I've given that's worked dividends. You got to wait for that opportunity for God to put them in the position to get that help.
Well, thank you for that. Chris, what would you say?
Well, I know you're getting short on time, and I mean, he cut. What do you add to that? I mean, those are all the points that we talk about as an organization. Yeah, and I think that's our regular message at all of our different locations for how we would answer that question. For if I added anything at all, it would simply be that point of stigma again, and how we talk about this stuff helps to aid that process and get people access to treatment. When we know how to talk about it, it helps to enable a better discussion. And that would be the only thing that. And again, I'm constantly beating the stigma drum, because I think it's critically important to providing access to care, and that's one of the greatest barriers, is access to care and knowing how to have that level of transparency. And besides that, Dave nailed it.
So final question, and I will invite anyone who is listening, if you have any particular questions, feel free to ask them now, and I'll go to ask Dave and Chris. Here's my final question for both of you. What's one thing that you hope that we learn as a people or as a society because of what we call the coronavirus or COVID-19? And it can relate to addiction, or it doesn't have to, but what's one thing that you hope that we learn because of what we've endured over the last couple of months? Dave, you can go first.
Well, I could talk about that one for a while, but I'll just focus on one thing.
You only got 1 minute, Dave.
I mean, it's just taught me personally just how much we take for granted in this very affluent country we live in the West, and how many things we're so dependent on to give us peace, to give us a sense of purpose, and all those things were just taken away. And, we're left with what? Our family, our faith, and it's just like, I think that was the Lord shouting to us, like, you've gone way too far as a culture. It's all about shopping. It's all about materialism. It's all about your identity as a person who has this position or whatever. And God just kind of said, nope, we're going to hit the brakes on that for a minute and just show you what's really important. I mean, that's what I hope we learn. I hope we don't go back to business as usual, especially as Christians, and don't have that message of like, life is fragile, life is short. Like, what are we really focusing on, because I don't know about you. I mean, I felt like society was about to collapse, even though it wasn't. It was kind of like the way the media was covering it, it made it all crazy. But I mean, I think that I felt that in my soul, like what really is holding our society together? Like what is our common thing? And a lot of it, sadly, is things that are going to pass away, things that we're not going to take with us. So just have a more eternal view of things, I think, is what, I want us to learn from this.
Yeah, I would just very briefly just say that it's hopefully it's taking time to understand who God is and getting to know Him. If there was ever a time to dig into a life of faith, it's obviously now. Chaos surrounds us, uncertainty surrounds us, and that's a huge one. Uncertainty is definitely uncomfortable. But I know that and we know that there's a God who loves us. There's a God who's for us. And He wants to reveal his Son to us through all this, and that would be my hope to see. It seems that in desperate times, in desperate places, that we can find the Lord in ways that we can't when things are good. So and I think that goes right along with what Dave was saying.
Yeah. Well, Chris and Dave, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I don't know if there's any particular questions. So any last word for either of you before we conclude? But thank you for just sharing from your heart, sharing your testimony, and even just helping us understand and to grow in our level of empathy and understanding of God's people. And so any kind of final words before we end now?
Yeah, I'll just say, just those who are listening and who catch us later, just pray that the Lord would reach out to those who need our services at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. We're really getting ready for who God's going to send to us. We always are ready, but really in this time. So just please pray that God would equip us to help those who, have been impacted greatly, and their substance use has gotten to the point where they're going to need our help. Once they're able to, get past the COVID and things start to go back to quote unquote normal, and then they might start considering getting help, that they would be able to find us.
And I would just say, again, our website, it's paatc.org. And if anybody needs to call, it's 844-888-8085. So again, paatc.org. and 844-888-8085, and we have people that are standing by, waiting to help for anybody who needs our services.
Well, know that we will pray for and with you as a congregation, and that we are here cheering you two on and just your faithful work with PA Adult and Teen Challenge. Thank you for your faithfulness to Jesus, to your own recovery, but more importantly, and in this moment, thank you for those you're working with to seek hope and liberation. You two inspire me, and I'm grateful to have spent the evening with you. And finally, happy Father's Day to the two of you as well. And so, friends, for joining, thank you so much tonight. I'll look forward to gathering with you all next week at 6 o'clock for our next episode of Expert Opinion. Blessings, my friends.